Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey peeps, today we're going to do that rarest of all reviews on my channel, the RPG review. And today we're going to take a look at Faith, the Sci-Fi RPG. Now, it's interesting, you don't see a lot of RPGs come in boxes like this, and that's because I wouldn't quite call this a full-on hybrid. It's definitely a role-playing game through and through, but it does have some board game elements to it in how you set up your character, the actual physical bits that you use to keep track of your character stats. There are no dice in the game. Sacrilege for a role-playing game. Well, actually, no. There's quite a few RPGs that don't use any dice at all, but in this case, there is a substitute for dice, and that is playing cards, which is an interesting thing. It's sort of a contentious subject among some board gamers as well. But the setting of Faith is very interesting. It's in well, the timeline seems a little bit nebulous, but I assume the very far future, judging by the state of humanity in this universe. But heavy sci-fi, where it takes place on the fringe of the galaxy. Wormholes connect everything. In fact, humans are sort of a side race. You can play as them, but the main stars are these other races, and in particular two races, the Exile and the Corvo, I believe. I can never get the names correct, but not even with games based on historical figures do I get the names correct. Do you expect me to get them right in the sci-fi game? But there's all these competing races going about the universe, and you and the other players, or there's a game master, and then the other players take control of characters set in this galaxy, in this universe. You can upgrade yourselves, get different skills, you start off with attributes, you have confrontations, you have tests using that card system I alluded to before. A lot of the things that are in traditional role-playing games, of course, are in here, just with a few tweaks. Now, a review of a role-playing game is a little bit unique for my channel because I can't really do it in the traditional way, but I would do a board game review going through every single mechanism because there's just too much, right? But I'm going to give you a brief look at all the components in the game and just touch on some of the rules very lightly, very briefly. Then we're going to come back. I'll let you know what I think. Faith, the Sci-Fi RPG, is a role-playing game with some board game elements. Specifically, it's a self-contained boxed game that has enough components to be played with up to 4 players, including the game master, and many of the aspects of an RPG that would be handled with pen, paper, or multiple books are instead kept track of with cards, cardboard player mats, and tokens. Of special note, notice that there are no dice. Of course, there is a modestly sized rulebook for Faith, filled with high-quality artwork, and aside from explanations of the mechanisms and hard and fast rules, there is a large amount of space dedicated to explaining the lore and current state of the galaxy. Without going into too many details, each player is going to create a character. Your player mat has many empty spaces in it where you place tokens representing your stats and your progression. The most important choice is, of course, your alien race. Every race, from humans to the insectoid Corvo to the Zerg-like Ravagers, have their own special abilities and flavor, and you'll have to decide which is best for you. Another important choice is your god. There are 5 gods in Faith, and they will dictate your moral and ethical code. Stay on the path of your god, and she might reward you with an extra power upgrade, but stray away from that path, and you will lose these powers and the favor of your god. Like all RPGs, characters have attributes and skills. For Faith, the attributes are Agility, Constitution, Dexterity, Faith, Link, and Mind. You'll get points to spend on these during character creation, though you may choose to divert some of those points to gain upgrade tokens. Some of these are bio upgrades like Regeneration or Hyper Charisma, and some are tech upgrades like Bionic Parts and Nanobots. You also get to distribute points amongst skills, balancing out your character with things like Ballistics, Hacking, and Medical. Every player gets a deck of cards. Each deck consists of numbered and suited cards and could double as a regular deck of playing cards. More importantly, those suits represent areas like space and nature. In fact, every character will have a natural affinity for their chosen area and can draw extra cards when playing the chosen suit. Every player starts with 7 cards. Confrontations always involve having to play these cards from your hand at the bequest of the GM, adding any relevant stats and hoping that you succeed. The GM has her own deck of cards to use for her NPCs, and in fact there is an NPC deck that she can use to put together the different challenges for the players. NPCs have their own stats and a limit to the cards that the GM can play on them. They also have built-in equipment and special abilities, all of which are detailed on the backs of the cards. The players have access to a gear deck for when they go shopping or find rewards on their adventures. Everything from guns, biosuits, swords, and more can be found. The GM and the players can use these card aids in place of constantly flipping through a book trying to get stats. Remember, though, that in a sci-fi game, you also need to keep track of both ammo and energy at times. Characters can, of course, die. If they take too much physical damage and start bleeding out, and they do not receive medical attention in time, they die a physical death. Characters can also take neural damage, and if their neural health is reduced to 0, they're traumatized and unconscious until they recover. If you're ever in a position where you're bleeding out and you're unconscious from neural health damage, you just die outright. Now, there's much more to Faith, but that gives you an idea of what to expect. Now, on to my final thoughts. Now, I had a good time with Faith, and so did the other players that I played with. I was the game master. I always end up as the game master, or the overlord, or the overseer. That's a whole other side rant. But it was fine. I had fun with Faith. I think it's a pretty decent game. But there's a lot to unpack here. I have a lot of thoughts about the individual bits here. Despite how short my overview was, I still want to expound on quite a bit of that. So start off with the theme, because theme is incredibly important for a role-playing game, especially, even more so than in a board game. And I like it a lot with Faith, because first off, I haven't had like a ton of role-playing game experience. For a long period of time, I was playing role-playing games, but it was only like 4 or 5 different titles over a wide expanse of time. So I don't have an experience with tons of or varied themes and genres, and science fiction was one I never really touched on much, so this was kind of refreshing to me. And also, especially since, while I don't feel like the universe of Faith is fleshed out that much, you can make a complaint that the book doesn't even have enough content for the universe. There's a lot of it in there, but not that much. Because of that, it feels not quite as fleshed out as it should be, but nevertheless, I liked it because it gave me a feeling of Mass Effect. Like, really far future, very advanced technology. It's not just sci-fi, it's far advanced sci-fi, and I like that. It's really brought to life by the artwork. The artwork is amazing in this game. It looks really good, and that's one of the reasons why, and we'll touch on this more in a moment, why it's helpful to have the card system in this game, because you can show off more of that artwork. So it's another side fringe benefit to that. So all that looks very good. The game is very easy to learn. The systems are not that difficult. It's very easy to jump into. And sessions are kind of fluid. They can be as long or short as you want them to be, really. It doesn't really... it doesn't drag on that much. I never got the feeling of that, although I haven't played the game that much, I'll go ahead and say. Let's talk about the components, right? So, and when I say the components, I mean the board game elements to Faith. Some things work, some things are and I kind of feel like the whole board game RPG thing is tacked on here. Now, the thing that really works is the thing that people would probably find the most contentious, and that is the card system. But I actually like the card system. I like that you have this affinity for certain environments, and therefore it gets better when you use those cards. And again, the side bonus of being able to actually see the cards, have the tactile experience of them with the cool artwork. It's just an interesting element. I guess you could say it's kind of a cop-out to not have dice and to do something different, to be something gimmicky. But in this case, I think it actually works. So I'm totally down with that system. Where I think it's a little more problematic is with the player boards, the counters, keeping track of your attributes and skills. While it seems like a good idea, and when I first saw it, I'm like, that's kind of neat. Actually putting it into practice, even just as a game master who didn't have to worry about that as much as the players had to, or at all, really, it just looks very annoying. Because the chips were constantly falling out. They don't really fit in that well. And again, that really feels gimmicky. And you still have to look up how the upgrades work all the time, right? Because you have gear cards, which is helpful. I like that, actually, that they have those. And the NPC cards, but you don't have cards for the upgrades, and there's a lot of upgrades. That's another annoying thing, is there's a whole huge pile I didn't show on camera of those upgrade tokens. very hard to keep track of and to keep sorted out. So at the end of it all, I would have been happier, or I think our players especially would have been happier just having sheets and writing things down, and then having a written out version of, even if they had to handwrite it themselves, of what the abilities did, like we all had to do back in the old days with D&D sheets, although a lot of us just do it online, or when I did play D&D. So this is where I think that the board game element is kind of tacked on, and maybe there's a reason why, tabletop pen and paper RPGs have that. And maybe that's just prior experience and bias showing, because that's what I was used to. That's what some of the other people I played with were used to. But I don't know. That's just a thing. And if you didn't have to worry about that, and if you got rid of the cardboard bits and had more card decks in the box, you could play with more players right out of the box, which I think would be a good thing as well. I do wish there was some pre-made scenarios in the core box. You can go online and find them, like an introductory scenario on the main website for Burning Games, the company. But I wish that again, this goes back to me wishing that the rulebook was more fleshed out with content for the game, not just the core rules, a little bit about the universe and so on. Talking more about the mechanisms, I like the god system. It's very interesting. I wish that was a little more fleshed out. Perhaps more options. An option for, and this is something I might have missed, but I didn't see it in just the core rules, but saying, hey, this is, again, my personal bias showing, but hey, I don't want to follow one of these godlike moral, ethical codes. So do I get a bonus for that? No. If you don't follow one of the moral, godlike paths, you will not be able to gain access to certain upgrades, which is, makes you feel like an exception to the other players. And again, that's bias showing, but also just would have been helpful to have those other options. That said, I thought it was interesting thematically that the gods are not just like, Faerun, Dungeons and Dragons gods who can actually walk the earth and are beings with personalities. They're just like broad ethical codes that the universe or the galaxy decided to encapsulate down into gods as a system of belief. I found that very interesting, and one of the few parts of the galaxy that felt fleshed out, at least thematically, if not mechanically, as much as I wanted it to. Which makes sense, since it is it's right there in the title of the game, Faith. So it's a big deal. So I just wish that mechanically it was worked out a little bit better, but I still like the concept of it. And again, a lot of the flavor of the game is there, and it's very solid. I like the systems. It's very simple and straightforward. It just needs to be fleshed out a bit more on a wider scale. But still, I think Faith is a very nice change of pace. I'm not into RPGs as much as I used to be, and perhaps there are other sci-fi RPGs out there now that do this better or comparably. But this was a newer experience for me, and I enjoyed my time with it, and I'm quite eager to see what they do in the future, actually. That is Faith, the sci-fi RPG from Burning Games. Check it out if you're so inclined.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.